It began with something so small no one thought it could matter, a harmless object placed on a perfectly trimmed lawn. But within days, anonymous complaints piled up, fines appeared without warning, and neighbors who once waved stopped making eye contact. Cameras were installed. Rules shifted overnight. Authority turned personal. What should have been ignored became a test of power, control, and pride inside a quiet neighborhood that claimed to value harmony. By the time the truth surfaced, reputations were destroyed and the HOA's image was beyond repair. How did something so trivial ignite a full-blown neighborhood war? The neighborhood had the kind of quiet that felt intentional, almost manufactured. Streets curved gently instead of running straight, lawns were trimmed to identical heights, and every mailbox matched down to the shade of black paint. It was the sort of place people moved to believing problems stayed outside the gates. For a long time, that belief held. Life there followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings began with sprinklers clicking on in perfect unison. Afternoons were calm enough to hear birds over distant lawnmowers. Weekends meant gardening, light repairs, and polite waves exchanged from driveways. Nothing flashy. Nothing controversial. Just order. The homeowner fit neatly into that routine. Working from home, keeping mostly to themselves, they valued peace more than attention. They paid HOA dues on time, followed the rules without much thought, and assumed the association existed to handle things no one wanted to worry about. Trash pickup schedules. Roof color approvals. The boring but necessary details of shared living. The HOA itself presented a polished image. Monthly emails spoke about community pride and property values. Notices were written in professional language, always signed by the board, never a single person. On the surface, it felt neutral, almost invisible. And for most residents, that was true. As long as nothing stood out, nothing happened. The home sat on a slightly larger lot than most, with a small garden near the front yard. Gardening became a quiet escape, a way to personalize a space that otherwise looked like every other house on the street. Flowers were chosen carefully, colors kept tasteful, everything still within what felt like common sense. No one complained. No warnings arrived. Life continued uninterrupted. That sense of normalcy made what happened next feel unreal. A small, decorative item appeared in the garden one weekend. Nothing loud. Nothing offensive. Just a harmless touch of personality, barely noticeable unless someone was actively looking for it. It blended into the landscaping, visible but not demanding attention. At the time, it felt insignificant enough to forget about almost immediately. But someone noticed. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come with anger or confrontation. It arrived quietly, in writing. A standard HOA notice. Formal language. A vague reference to a rule about appearances. No explanation beyond that. No urgency, but no warmth either. It felt like a misunderstanding. Something easily cleared up. After all, similar decorations existed throughout the neighborhood. Seasonal items. Stone figures. Yard accents that had been there for years. The assumption was that the HOA simply needed clarification. Instead, the notices continued. What had once been an invisible governing body suddenly felt present. Watching. Measuring. Interpreting rules in ways that hadn't mattered before. The tone shifted subtly at first, but enough to register. Language became firmer. Deadlines shorter. References to community standards more frequent. At the same time, the atmosphere on the street began to change. Neighbors who once lingered to chat seemed more reserved. Friendly waves turned into quick nods. Conversations stopped when someone approached. It wasn't open hostility, just distance. As if everyone sensed something forming but didn't want to be pulled into it. The HOA meetings, once sparsely attended, grew more structured. Agendas tightened. Certain topics were emphasized repeatedly, all circling back to the same vague idea of uniformity. Order. Control. It became clear that enforcement wasn't random anymore. It was focused. Still, it didn't seem possible that something so small could escalate. The belief lingered that reason would eventually prevail. That rules existed to serve the community, not dominate it. That no one would push a situation this far over a minor detail. That belief would not last. Behind the scenes, lines were already being drawn. Complaints were being logged. Interpretations of bylaws were being reshaped. Authority was becoming personal. And while the neighborhood still looked peaceful from the outside, the groundwork for conflict had already been laid. What appeared to be a quiet, well-managed community was about to reveal how fragile that image really was, how quickly order could turn into obsession once power found a target. And it all began before anyone realized they were standing at the edge of something much bigger than a simple HOA rule. What followed felt less like a disagreement and more like a slow tightening of pressure, applied so gradually it was almost hard to pinpoint when things crossed the line. The notices became routine, arriving with mechanical consistency, each one slightly more severe than the last. What had started as a mild reminder turned into formal warnings, then fines, then threats framed as procedural next steps. The language stayed professional, but the intent behind it grew unmistakable. The rules themselves began to feel elastic. Interpretations shifted depending on the day, the mood of the board, or the convenience of enforcement. Something acceptable one week became a violation the next. Measurements were taken without notice. Photos appeared in HOA records that no one remembered being taken. The same bylaws that once seemed straightforward now felt weaponized, bent just enough to justify whatever action came next. The fines escalated quickly. Small amounts at first, almost insulting in their pettiness, but frequent enough to feel invasive. Then larger penalties appeared, justified by newly cited clauses and administrative fees. Each notice referenced the previous one, creating a paper trail designed to look airtight, even though the foundation was shaky at best. Paying them felt like surrender. Refusing felt dangerous. The emotional toll settled in before the financial one. Every morning carried a sense of anticipation, not the good kind, but the anxious kind that made opening an email feel like bracing for impact. The front yard, once a place of quiet pride, began to feel like contested ground. Cameras appeared in neighboring windows. Curtains shifted. The sense of being watched became impossible to ignore. Shared spaces no longer felt shared. Access to community amenities suddenly came with temporary restrictions. Administrative reviews stretched indefinitely. Requests for clarification were met with silence or vague responses that answered nothing. It became clear that the system wasn't broken, it was functioning exactly as intended. Neighbors reacted in different ways. Some distanced themselves completely, unwilling to risk becoming collateral damage. Others offered quiet support, usually in private, never in writing. Stories surfaced cautiously, often prefaced with hesitation. Similar patterns. Similar pressure. Similar fear of retaliation. It became obvious this wasn't an isolated incident, just the most visible one. Then came the inspections. They happened without warning, early in the morning or late in the evening, always framed as routine compliance checks. Every detail was scrutinized. Landscaping symmetry. Placement of bins. Decorative intent. Even neutral elements were flagged as potential concerns. The goal no longer seemed to be correction, but accumulation, stacking violations until resistance felt futile. What made it worse was the inconsistency. Other homes with far more obvious deviations remained untouched. Decorations that clearly violated written rules stood undisturbed. The selective enforcement wasn't subtle anymore. It was deliberate, almost daring, as if inviting someone to challenge it. Attempts to resolve the issue amicably went nowhere. Emails requesting meetings were ignored or redirected. When responses came, they referenced authority rather than logic. Decisions were final. Appeals were not recommended. The message was clear without being stated outright: compliance was expected, not discussion. The emotional shift from confusion to frustration happened quietly, but once it set in, it was impossible to shake. The situation stopped feeling absurd and started feeling personal. not because of the object at the center of it, but because of what it represented. Control. Compliance. The unspoken rule that standing out even accidentally made you a target. Then the interference crossed into something harder to rationalize. Things moved when no one was watching. Objects were repositioned just enough to create new violations. Documentation appeared that contradicted reality. Notices referenced actions that hadn't occurred. It felt like reality itself was being rewritten on paper, with official letterheads and signatures to back it up. Security measures went up out of necessity, not paranoia. Documentation became a daily habit. Screenshots. Timestamps. Records of communication. What started as self-protection slowly turned into something else: awareness. Patterns emerged. Timelines aligned. The harassment wasn't random. It was coordinated. With a major community event approaching and attention about to turn outward, the question was no longer whether the conflict would explode but where, and in front of how many witnesses. The fallout did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, as systems that once seemed immovable began to buckle under scrutiny. In the days following the public exposure, the neighborhood felt suspended in an unfamiliar stillness. No new notices appeared. No warning emails arrived. The constant hum of enforcement that had once lingered in the background simply stopped, as if someone had unplugged it. For the first time in months, there was nothing to brace for. That absence alone felt surreal. The front yard no longer felt like contested territory. Walking past the garden no longer carried a sense of being watched. What had once been a source of tension slowly returned to what it had always been meant to be: just a personal space, ordinary and harmless. The object that had triggered everything stood quietly where it belonged, stripped of the meaning that power had forced onto it. But beneath the calm, consequences were already taking shape. The investigation moved beyond the neighborhood with an efficiency that surprised many residents. What had been dismissed internally for years now carried weight because it was documented, visible, and impossible to explain away as individual misunderstanding. Patterns mattered. Timelines mattered. And once authority was required to answer for itself, it could no longer hide behind vague language or procedural jargon. The HOA's structure began to unravel. Board members resigned one by one, some quickly, others after attempting damage control that only deepened suspicion. Committees dissolved. Contracts were paused. Financial records were reviewed. What residents had once been told was orderly and transparent revealed gaps that raised more questions than answers. Refunds followed. Fines that had once felt final were suddenly reversed. Charges quietly disappeared from accounts without explanation, as if acknowledging them would only draw more attention. For many residents, this was the first tangible confirmation that what they had endured was not normal, not justified, and not their fault. The emotional impact reached further than expected. Neighbors who had spent years keeping their heads down began reconnecting. Conversations that once happened only in whispers now happened openly. Stories were shared without fear of retaliation. Experiences that had felt isolating suddenly made sense when placed alongside others. The sense of individual failure dissolved into collective understanding. What became clear was that the conflict had never been about enforcement alone. It had been about how easily authority could exploit silence, and how quickly rules designed for order could be turned into tools of pressure when no one questioned them. Life in the neighborhood did not snap back to how it had been before. It changed. The illusion of perfection faded, replaced by something more honest. Lawns were still maintained. Streets were still quiet. But the blind trust was gone. Residents read notices more carefully. Meetings were attended. Questions were asked. Transparency was no longer optional, it was expected. A new HOA eventually formed, stripped down and closely watched. Rules were rewritten with clarity instead of flexibility. Enforcement guidelines were documented in plain language. Oversight mechanisms were put in place to prevent concentration of power. The association still existed, but it no longer operated from the shadows. For the homeowner at the center of it all, The resolution came with a complicated mix of relief and reflection. Winning did not feel triumphant in the way stories often portray it. There was no celebration, no sense of conquest. Instead, there was a quiet reclaiming of normalcy. The ability to exist in one's own home without fear. The freedom to personalize a space without anticipating punishment. The simple comfort of knowing that the rules would not shift overnight to target someone for standing out. The experience left marks, though not visible ones. Trust, once broken, did not fully return. The awareness of how quickly order could turn into obsession lingered. There was a lasting understanding that power often reveals itself not through dramatic abuse, but through persistence, paperwork, and pressure applied over time. That lesson stayed. The neighborhood, too, carried that awareness forward. Residents became more involved not because they wanted control, but because they had seen what happened when they disengaged. Silence had been the environment where abuse thrived. Attention became the antidote. Not confrontation, not chaos, but presence. Looking back, the absurdity of it all became impossible to ignore. An object that should have meant nothing had exposed everything. Not because it was special, but because it was small enough to test boundaries without immediate backlash. It revealed how fragile authority becomes when challenged by consistency instead of compliance. How systems designed to maintain order collapse when they are forced to justify themselves publicly. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends shared it. Online discussions echoed similar experiences from other communities. The details differed, but the pattern was familiar. Associations that overreached. Boards that confused governance with dominance. Residents who endured far more than they should have because resistance felt risky. In that sense, the conflict stopped being personal. It became a reminder. A reminder that rules are only as fair as the people enforcing them. That authority without accountability always drifts toward abuse. That communities function best not when they are perfectly uniform, but when they allow room for individuality without punishment. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforced a truth many learned too late: standing up does not always require shouting. Sometimes it requires patience, documentation, and the willingness to let the truth speak for itself when given the chance. The garden returned to being just a garden. The neighborhood returned to being just a neighborhood. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The power dynamic had changed, not because one person defeated an institution, but because exposure stripped the institution of its mask. What once felt like an endless battle over something trivial ended as a lesson written into the community's memory. Because when something so small can reveal something so broken, the real question isn't why the conflict happened. It's how many times it happens quietly, in places where no one is watching, waiting for someone to finally pay attention.